government leadership in the Soviet Union from the death of Stalin to 1960. And my reminiscence of that period was a strong power struggle between the then Politburo members and their mutual fears. I wonder what emphasis you give to this factor. First question. Second question, in your talk, you didn't touch upon nuclear weaponry and the fact that by 1949, eventually, the Soviet Union had its own hydrogen bomb, which I suppose, believe, made an impact and affected their foreign policy.
Well, let's take two then, if you want. Then we have one up there.
Just one quick question about the late 40s and early 50s. Wouldn't it make perfect sense for Stalin and the Moscow to not want allies far away that they could not control in the soon-to-be former colonies? Because they could end up in worst-case scenarios like public relations disasters like the civil war in Spain, which would damage the image of the communist cause that Stalin wanted to see. Thank you.
Well, you take one more. I have, yes.
Thank you for an interesting discussion. I have a question regarding the policy implications of your theory. China is no longer as different from the United States as it was, say, 30 years ago. But the implication of your argument is that we should look at identity issues. And the major issue for international relations now is, can we expect conflictual relations between China and the United States? But the question is, what is identity, and will there be, there could still be differences between China and the United States. Let's say nationalism, for example. The Chinese could say, well, we're no longer communists, we cannot be antagonistic toward the United States on communist basis, but we are still a different nations and so on. So exactly what should we expect of these identity issues?
I'll work backwards on the policy implications. I think constructivism is a rather disappointing stream of IR theory for policymakers because it doesn't give them instrumental purchase on any particular means at their disposal. Why? Well, because identities are very thick and sticky, right? And they're constructed on a daily basis by millions of people within a society. A decision maker can't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to change my state's identity, right? Instead, it's almost like, what I think what Lenin called a constantly operating factor of international policy. It's a structure with which one has to deal. So the only policy implications of this is to understand what the discourses of national identity and their challenges are in a society. I mean, one example that always comes to my mind when I talk about this is the Iranian Revolution of 1979, where Western intelligence services, and indeed Western embassies in Tehran, were completely taken by surprise with this new kind of radical Islam that came to power. Well, if they had been doing a discourse analysis of Iranian domestic society, they would have seen this huge stream of national identity talk, if you will, coming out of the bazaars and on Khomeini's cassettes, etc., which would have given them some notion of, well, there's an alternative understanding of what it means to be Iranian, and it's not the Pahlavi project; it's a different project. Now, perhaps there are policy implications for that, but I'm not going to say. But at least it would have been an understanding. Now, in terms of doing again, continuing on with the policy implications, one thing I came away with from the book, it's in the conclusion, is, how to put this, how important the existential power of the West was. That is, all the West had to do was be. and do what it did, namely just go on being the West, you know, being capitalist and democratic and prosperous and what have you. And just by being what it is and what it does, it ended up exercising enormous power over the Soviet project. That is, it was a corrosive power that the West never realized that it had. It didn't realize it had that much power. In fact, what's striking from, at least in my work from 45 to 58, when doing the archival work, I read a lot of memos of discussions between Soviet officials and American officials on cultural exchanges and what have you. Well, the U.S. in particular would follow a tit-for-tat policy. They would never allow like more Soviets to come to the U.S. than the Soviets allow Americans to the Soviet Union, right? They would insist on strict equality. When in fact, had the U.S. recognized this existential power, they would have flooded the Soviet Union with Americans. They would have flooded the U.S. with Soviets, right? And West Europeans would have done the same thing. But there's a lack of confidence, I think, and fear. Of course, there's a discourse of danger in the United States as well. I mean, I'm always asked to do the U.S. side with this, but I can't do both, really. So it's too much work. Plus, I think it helps have a kind of outsider perspective on the Soviet project. I'm too implicated in the U.S. project to probably give it a fair shake. In any case, my point is that the policy implications are not obvious because there is because the kind of power I'm talking about is not manipulable, except on the narrow margins. I mean, I gave it in that footnote. I mean, it's clear to me, at least, now there's a lot of historiography on this now, is that the U.S. civil rights laws changed much more rapidly because of the Soviet threat than they would have otherwise. Right? I mean, the U.S. realized it couldn't go around yammering about freedom after World War II and have 15% of its population being lynched and not being able to vote and so forth. And you know, Truman recognized this as early as 1948. So on the margins, one can change one's national identity if you'll make it more consistent with the narrative that you're saying. But it's almost akin to Joe Nye's discussion of soft power, which he treats, I think, too instrumentally. To me, like soft power is like falling in love, right? You can't tell someone you have to love me, right? I mean, that's what soft power is, right? Not being able to do that. I mean, either you love me or you don't, right? Either what I am and what I do attracts you or it doesn't. And so I think there's a lot of contingency in this story as well, in the sense that, there's nothing, I don't want to say this because it'd be very radical, but there's nothing inherently superior about the West that I'm talking about, right? But relative to the Soviet project, it was understood as far more attractive by many, many Soviets, right? Which goes to this issue of China. So what's more attractive, the Chinese model or this Western model? Well, I don't think we know. But I can say this, that if China democratizes, right, identities are always relational. I mean, imagine what would happen. Imagine that, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States lost its significant other in the world. And what were people starting to chatter about in the early 90s? Well, maybe there's a European other, right? The social market is different than Wild West capitalism. There's a European alternative to the US. But then 9/11 happened, bang. Since identity is relational, the whole world ends up coalescing around another us-them dichotomy. So differences between the US and Europe were forgotten. I mean, who cares about their different brands of capitalism? That doesn't matter. We have this existential threat out there that we all need to counter. Well, same thing with China. I mean, if China begins to democratize, and its economic model proves durable, and economic inequality declines and so forth, who knows? Maybe the Chinese model looked very attractive. Especially if, imagine a discourse of national identity in the United States that looks a lot more like Bush. Imagine the U.S. being like a Christian crusading nation. It's not too far from being that, right? I mean there are 40 million votes for Christian national identity in the United States. And you only need 60 million to win the presidency. And Bush managed to win twice. And he brought that Christian national identity with him and fundamentally transformed U.S. understanding of the Middle East, because it's a Christian Zionist part of American national identity that helps explain relations with Israel and the rest of the Middle East that isn't there in the Obama administration, right? So since identity is relational, you can't say for sure what the competition between, Chinese-U.S. future is going to look like without doing the identity work to find out what the relationship is. I'm sorry I've gone on for so long, but I actually took that question as an opportunity to say things that I'd written down in a previous version of this talk that I wanted to get out there about existential power, the extreme difficulty of manipulating that kind of structural power. On the third world not wanting the third world, I mean, I agree with you, but it cuts both ways in the sense that after the discourse of difference came to power, they still could have understood the third world, the developing world in that way, right? As this bunch of uncontrollable allies far, far away. But instead what happens is the discourse of difference begins to understand them as potential allies, whereas before they were simply understood as being locked into the imperialist camp. On nuclear weapons, I mean, there's some interesting quotes from, I have to confess that a lot of my knowledge of Stalin's attitude toward nuclear weapons comes from David Holloway's work and not my own work, because my survey of the archives wasn't specific enough to go after the nuclear issue. But I think I can kind of give a potted history. You're absolutely right. But it seems as if the Khrushchev team took to the meaning of the nuclear revolution a lot more quickly than the Stalinist team did. That is, it was an absolute weapon. It absolutely, it adopted mutually assured destruction, instantly. So in that sense, it definitely made the Soviet Union feel more secure. But again, it took a new collection of elites to understand it in that way. Because Stalin certainly didn't think of nuclear weapons as making the Soviet Union more secure. He did understand that a continued American monopoly on atomic weapons was a bad idea. But even, as I said, there's a whole bunch of quotes in the book about just how confident he was the U.S. would never attack the Soviet Union. About a political struggle, this actually is going to help me address your question about the politics. Like you asked about the December '52 meeting where where Stalin talks about, does he invoke the invulnerability because he doesn't believe, because he believes her, or instrumentally? Well, the constructivist approach would say it doesn't matter whether beliefs are true or not, because the discourse itself is constraining, right? So behaviors, understandings, and interests follow from the discursive constructions of reality, such that even if he's being cynical in his use of the words, they have implications for how people behave and understand them. So discourse traps decision makers, right? Such that, let's pretend, for the sake of argument, that he knows that, in fact, the Soviet Union is secure, and that all he's doing is provoking fear to justify his domestic politics. Well, what happens, though, is that the behavior of the Soviet Union across the board is consistent with someone who does believe it, right? So we don't need to differentiate between true beliefs and cynical beliefs from a discursive point of view. And I'll go back to the very first question. On this hermeneutical circle, I'm a social scientist and a Popperian. I love Karl Popper. So I believe in making falsifiable statements. And hence, I was delighted to find out that my work was falsified, both in this book and in the previous book. By what? Well, by the appearance of this great power identity. I point out in the book pretty frequently, and I said it in the talk as well, that there was a great power identity for the Soviet Union too, and it doesn't come from domestic discourse. I can find that nowhere in any text, other than three institutional sites: the Defense Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, and in Presidium discussions. Right? So it's clear to me, at least, that this great power identity is being institutionalized in particular sites. It's not a societal identity. Societies understand the Soviet Union as a great power, at least at this point anyway. Maybe ultimately they will. They certainly do in Russia today. But in the Soviet Union then they did. And it's being reproduced through interaction with the United States. Right? Because there are two prongs of constructivism. Right? There's a systemic version of constructivism that thinks that state identities are produced through interaction between and among states. And one of the reasons why I got into this business is I wanted to point out that, wait a second, states also have societies, and state identity is also constructed vertically between state and society, not just horizontally between and among states. So both of them are going on simultaneously. So I was delighted to find that I found a strategic identity, if you will, an interactive identity at the interstate level that could demonstrate that, in fact, I was falsifiable, right? That, in fact, I did find an identity that I didn't find from society, but in fact, something that's being generated at that level of interaction. I'm done.
Any more questions? Not for Norris? Yeah.
Oh, this is not a question, it's more a comment. A result of your analysis of the factors, the societal factors. The societal factors behind the shifts.
Can't you hear?
No.
No, it's better. No. No?
Maybe take the mic.
Well, take this mic. No, it's not directly related to the empirical findings in your book, but anyhow, you have demonstrated that once the perception of threats was changed for the perception of differences, the Soviet society, even after Stalin, immediately after his death, with the Communist Party dictatorship, as it were, there were mechanisms to both to aggregate and to articulate distinct policies. And I think this is a very interesting finding in view of what is happening in the contemporary world, where it's perfectly possible with societal construction, so to speak, and articulation of new values, but a lack of aggregation mechanism. And of course I am referring to what insights can we get from your use of societal constructivism in a politically ordered, although authoritarian society. What insights can we draw to societies without any stable institutional structure, such as Putin's Russia? So this is more a comment than
Thank you. I think that was a well, good last comment, because that will bring us up to today and our discussions for the Russia workshop during this Jubilee conference, and for our own thoughts and discussions in the future. Anyway, I thank you a lot for this interesting and thoughtful presentation, and I recommend you all to actually to buy it and to read it, because it's well, very interesting. And there are some information sheets here, and there is one spare copy that you can well, look through. So thank you all for coming in, and thank you, Hopf.